Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University and to our weekly research seminar. My name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Deputy Director here at CSAC. It is my great pleasure to welcome today a good friend, former colleague of mine from the Brookings Institution, Dr. Tom Wright. Dr. Wright is the Director of the Center for the US and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. He is here today to speak about his second book, Aftershocks, which focuses on the impact of the current pandemic on the international order. Tom's previous book, All Measures Short of War, I also highly recommend it as another very insightful look into contemporary issues in international relations. Dr. Wright received his doctorate from Georgetown University, and I would note that the second book that he'll be speaking about today is co-authored with our very own Colin Kahl, senior fellow at FSI and former CSAC co-director. This is a project they completed minutes before Colin was confirmed as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, but I know this is a wonderful project, and we're very much looking forward to hearing from Dr. Wright today. Without much further ado, let me turn it over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Harold, and it's a great pleasure to be here, not least because Colin was a co-author and we had great Stanford ORAs on our project as we wrote it over the last year, but also because this is one of the very rare sort of in-person book events that I've done for the book. So it's particularly exciting to talk to everyone today and to everyone as well online. So I thought what I'd do was talk a bit about the main arguments in the book, but before I do that, I wanted to say a little bit about the background, about why we decided to write the book and what our sort of thinking was, because Colin and I guess when the pandemic started, we both wrote pieces of him for War in the Rocks and me in the Atlantic about the long-term geopolitical impact of the pandemic, which in that early stage was very speculative, right? It was informed speculation, but basically we were trying to figure out where this global crisis was going to go. And Colin called me and suggested that maybe we write a longer piece together, a book. We thought it might be a short book at that point, sort of looking at some of the longer term implications. But as we talked about it, we realized that even more important than what the international order, the trajectory it would take after the pandemic, was the question of what did the pandemic reveal about the international order today, right? Because this pandemic took place at a very unusual and worrying moment in geopolitics after a decade of attrition in the international order following the financial crisis. We'd seen the rise of populism and nationalism, increasing authoritarianism in countries like China and Russia, the election of Donald Trump, of course, in the United States, Brexit in Europe. We saw the breakdown of international cooperation and multilateral institutions in the preceding years. And so without sort of overusing the jargon of the pandemic, but the international order was already immunocompromised on the eve of the pandemic. And so the question that we really wanted to try to answer in real time through an analytical narrative of the events as they were unfolding was, how would the international community react to a truly global crisis at a time of nationalism, rivalry, and unilateralism? What worked? What didn't work, and what are the lessons for where we go from here? So that was sort of the starting premise of the project. It was a little bit challenging, of course, because when we started this book in late April, May of 2020, the pandemic had only really just begun. But I would say we benefited from extraordinary research done by journalists and other researchers all around the world in every aspect of the pandemic. Of course, the multitude of reports throughout that period and data that was made available. But we supplemented that, and this is what I think one of the hopefully value-added pieces of the book is, with ongoing interviews with senior officials from around the world throughout the course of the pandemic. So we talked to US government officials, WHO officials, European officials at the beginning, over the course of the summer, in the fall, in the winter, and then in the spring of 2021, and try to really check in to see how they were sort of feeling or what some of the major impacts were geopolitically on the pandemic and as they sort of thought about it. So what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about some of the main sort of findings. And I would say our sort of overarching argument in the book is that the geopolitics of the moment really overwhelmed the international response, right? That the international response was seriously impaired by geopolitical rivalry and nationalism, and that in a way, there was sort of a negative synergy between rivalry and the pandemic. The pandemic made rivalry worse, and rivalry, in a way, made the pandemic much harder to contain and made the pandemic worse. And I think the main sort of lesson going forward is how do we prepare for future pandemics in a world that sort of remains broken? Obviously, we would like to repair the international order and have all countries cooperate with each other. But really what the pandemic revealed was that we also need a plan to be able to deal with these transnational threats in the world that we actually have, which is obviously pretty difficult to fix. But I'd like to begin really by thinking about China and China's role in this, because of course, that's where COVID originated from in December of 2019. And we start the China story by looking back at SARS in 2002 and 2003 and at the response to the SARS epidemic at the time, when China was pretty secretive, not very cooperative in the response. The WHO at the time directly criticized China for its response. And the Chinese response in reaction to that criticism evolved. They became a bit more cooperative with the international community. Of course, SARS was largely controlled by the summer of 2003. And by that point, China had begun to put in place some real reforms to ensure that its response would never be repeated, that the next time around, China would be better prepared. So we saw a strengthening of the Chinese CDC modeled on the American CDC. We saw new provisions put in place to ensure more rapid communication of information and data from the provinces to central authorities in China, so you'd have a rapid response. And we saw more cooperation from Chinese scientists with the international community. Throughout the 2010, senior Chinese scientific advisors and officials like George Gao, who heads up the Chinese CDC, participated in WHO missions and different sort of delegations in response to public health emergencies. And so on the eve of COVID-19, those reforms were largely in place. Now, they've begun to erode a little bit on the international cooperation side, and I can talk more about that in the context of US-China relations in the few years prior. But for the most part, there was an exercise, a major exercise in July of 2019 to prepare for a future pandemic. And the premise of that was these reforms, right? China was going to respond in a bit of a different way. But when COVID-19 hit, many of those reforms sort of melted away, right? And we saw China really repeat its behavior from SARS, except maybe worse in some cases. And some people attribute that to, the reluctance of officials in Hubei province to tell central authorities in Beijing how bad things were. But it is also true that when Xi Jinping took over in early January, that he doubled down on that secrecy and that lack of cooperation. And so they refused to share critical data and information with WHO labs around the world, as they were obligated to do. The sharing of the genetic sequencing of the virus took place because a Chinese scientist defied a government order and did so on his own with his Australian scientific partner when they sent it to a website to get it out there. It was only the next day then the Chinese government officially released it. And so we saw that sort of secrecy. We also saw a crackdown on doctors and nurses and others who were speaking out. And so I don't think it's fair just to attribute that to this tension between provinces and central authorities. And then throughout, of course, 2020, we saw a China that became more assertive after they succeeded in suppressing the virus very little acknowledgement of error, a continuing tussle with the WHO. And the reason why I think this is significant, and we think it's significant and talk about it in the book, is I think it does tell us something important about the future, that if the reforms that were put in place after SARS didn't work, then how can we guarantee that reforms put in place after COVID-19 will work? And what lessons should we take from that? Why did that failing sort of occur? And how can we remedy that going forward in the future? Turning to the United States, we start that story by really looking at, this theory that the Trump administration was slow to respond and slow even to acknowledge COVID-19 because of bureaucratic changes made in the National Security Council when then National Security Advisor John Bolton abolished the Global Health Directorate. There was a de-emphasizing a pandemic. So that was a story we were expecting to find. But what surprised us actually was that the Trump administration senior officials there were amongst the first really in the world to realize the severity of COVID-19. Now, partly that's because of your colleague here, Matt Pottinger, who I think has a unique sort of background in this. He was a journalist for the Wall Street Journal during SARS and has a sort of a personal family background in infectious disease and in pandemics. And so he, along with Fauci, Redfield, and others, I think were alarmed pretty early on. The National Security Council actually had significant meetings on this in January, far earlier than European officials. European officials were very late, maybe mid-February, by the time they really realized that this was a severe looming threat. But what happened in the United States was not sort of a failure to understand sort of early on. It was really after the partial travel ban was put on China in late January that then the subsequent 6 weeks were sort of squandered. And you saw people within the administration like Pottinger, Anne O'Brien and others make the argument for a real robust response, for real investment in critical supplies and, to work with the private sector and to work in diagnostics and therapeutics and develop sort of sources of masks and other things that are now sort of taken for granted. And really the president's view was that he had done his part with the travel ban. He didn't want to do anything that might disrupt the economy in an election year. And there was sort of time to wait. And so nothing really happened until March 11th, at which point Trump shut down the American economy as it was shutting down itself in response to the pandemic. And at that point, something very significant happened, because you remember that while relations with China were pretty fraught for most of the Trump administration, January and February of 2020 might have been a high point in terms of good relations, because the phase one trade deal had been signed in mid-January. And so Trump was actually on pretty good terms with Xi Jinping. But on March 11th, when he felt like he was forced to shut down the economy and really jeopardize his own political chances in the election, he then blamed China with a vengeance. And so in the book, we try to show that Trump sort of changed his position from being more of an arbiter, sort of more in the middle between those who favored more containment measures in China and those who saw the problem more in economic and trade terms. He then basically gave, if not a blank check, he certainly gave a lot more latitude to those who wanted a tougher response. And so really one of the big stories of 2020 is that the US-China piece, because of China's response to COVID and its failure to sort of abide by these reforms and its very aggressive and assertive foreign policy afterwards, combined with that American response and more of a singular focus on China, that was really a critical, pivotal moment in this US-China rivalry. Now, it may have had deeper roots. It certainly has deeper roots than the pandemic, but the manner of that sort of change, I think, is important, right? And that occurred over the pandemic. And that response really shaped US policy toward the whole pandemic. And while there was some response in the public health domain, I think it's fair to say that they largely neglected that to focus on the geopolitical piece, right? So the geopolitical piece in terms of rivalry with China was a more significant piece for them than sort of the public health piece. And I think they sort of basically acknowledged that to us, that there was that the lane they were more comfortable in a way, was seeing this as symptomatic of a broader China problem. And nowhere was that clearer than with the WHO. And that's sort of the third sort of observation I'd like to make on the role of the WHO. And I'll get to Trump's relationship with the WHO in a minute. But the WHO was in a very difficult position. You know, in January of 2020, they were faced with Xi Jinping on the one hand and with Donald Trump on the other hand. And they were in a very difficult geopolitical environment. And they had a leader, Tedros, the Director General, an Ethiopian former foreign minister, who I think his sort of view of this was that he could deal with this by personal diplomacy, right? He could work with the Chinese, he could work with the Americans, sort of feel his way around naturally and organically to try to get them on board with practical cooperation. And how he would do that would be to praise them publicly or certainly lay off any type of criticism of them directly in the hope of getting sort of incremental practical cooperation on the ground. That was his sort of theory of the case. And in the China case in January of 2020, at a time when WHO officials internally were very alarmed about China's response, they were calling it worse than SARS, saying they had a real problem, they were getting no cooperation, that the leader of the WHO was out saying it was an exemplary response and it couldn't possibly be going better. And that was not sort of cognitive dissonance. That was really part of a strategy, which was to try to get him on a trip to China in late January, then to try to get a WHO delegation in to try to get them to share some critical information. And they really believed, and I think still believe, that that was the right response in a moment of crisis, right? That's their sort of attitude on it. But in the United States, and there was and in much of the rest of the world, there was a very different view, which was that that approach actually was letting China off the hook. And they look back at the WHO's response during SARS, when the then Director General Gro Brundtland, a Norwegian doctor and politician, took a much tougher stance. They believed that that was the way to sort of go about it, that you didn't need to directly criticize China, but you shouldn't unwarrantably praise them either, right? So you should either accurately describe what they were doing or not doing, or you should maybe just not say anything and let silence speak volumes. And so that clash really spiraled. And after March 11th, when the US shutdown occurred, Trump's sort of turn against China turned into a turn against the WHO as well. And we try to document this in the book. We're sort of the view that Trump never really formally intended to leave the WHO, but he often sort of escalated a threat just on the spur of the moment, and sort of improved even in speeches, including on one occasion in May, to the point where the US did actually formally give notice of withdrawal in the summer, right? And that sort of, I can talk more about that in the conversation piece of it, but that was something that the US ambassador to the WHO, Andrew Bremberg, I think tried to avoid. They were trying to get reforms. But by that point, the international community had sort of lost all tolerance or patience with Trump and weren't really willing to negotiate. And so the US was on its way out. That was sort of horrifying to the Europeans, who were sort of the view that, yes, maybe the WHO needs reforms, but the worst possible time to do that is in the middle of a pandemic, right? That there's time to sort of look to those reforms afterwards. So turning to the Europeans just briefly, because I think that's sort of an interesting piece of this, and that's sort of my fourth observation, which is this was a horrific crisis for Europe. It was extremely difficult because, as many of you will know, the EU is involved in almost every facet of public policy except for one, which is health policy, which is largely almost entirely the domain of national governments. So they were really caught unawares with this crisis, and they weren't really prepared to deal with it at the EU level. It also affected the so-called southern countries first, in Italy and Spain, sort of disproportionately. So it mapped over some of those fissures that already had existed from the financial crisis. So they felt like they were being left behind and not given any assistance on the economic piece of this. And it was so bad that and of course the borders closed unilaterally, and the European leaders, instead of working with each other to sort of distribute scarce supplies, were basically competing with each other for those supplies, including outbidding or even stealing each other's stuff on runways, nationalizing each other's companies if they were based in their own country, particularly in the case of France, that did that on a number of occasions towards Sweden and other countries. And by April and May, European leaders were actually worried that the COVID crisis could lead to the collapse of the EU, or at least a serious unraveling, if, for instance, citizens of Italy felt that they were being told to adhere to very stringent fiscal rules when they were trying to recover and getting no assistance. And so Europe made a big leap forward on fiscal integration. They had this so-called Hamiltonian moment in the summer, and they felt largely by the summer that it was a big success story. When we were writing the book, it felt like a redemptive moment. But of course, with COVID, it's a very long tail, right? So countries that do well in one moment do terrible at another. And Europe really missed the boat on vaccine development. And then they had a horrific sort of fall and winter. And then when the vaccines came out, they were largely discredited because they sort of fell behind on vaccine distribution because of a lack of supply. Can talk more about that again later. But then they recovered from that and actually surpassed the United States in vaccine distribution. So it's very much a roller coaster, I think, in the EU. I think they have come stronger out of COVID in an overall net sort of assessment, but it was a very difficult crisis, for them. I'm happy to talk more in the conversation piece about other parts of the world. We have a significant part of the book on the developing world, particularly on countries like Bangladesh and Peru and others that did very well over the last 20 years in terms of GDP growth and income levels, but were really hammered by the pandemic economically, if not in the public health domain. And so some of the responses, I think, were particularly ill-suited to those countries. We talk a lot about the different crises that emerged from the public health piece on democracy and technology as well. But I'd like to just focus on a couple of other things before I close. One is sort of the rare bright spots in the pandemic in terms of things that surprised us, I think, as we went along, that went better than expected. And the other is to return to the main point I made at the beginning about the main takeaway and sort of what that means for where we're headed. But in terms of the bright spots from the pandemic, to me, there are sort of two that were very surprising, right? One is on the financial side. We saw this incredible response by central banks very early on. We talked to a number of central bank officials who were really alarmed by what was occurring in the treasury market in particular, and believed that in some ways it was worse than in 2008-09, that they could face a full-scale collapse of the treasury market, and they reacted in a very large scale to avert that, I think, very successfully. And that was then backed up by a very large fiscal response. In Europe, in the ECB, they were less worried about the treasury market, but they were worried about a general economic collapse, and they acted on a very large scale after an initial wobble that Lagarde, in terms of some remarks she made. And that, I think, was very significant. And the phrase we kept hearing, which is interesting from a global governance point of view, the officials told us, they said this was an example of correlation without coordination, right? So you didn't have really any formal coordination, let alone cooperation between the central banks, but they sort of all did the right thing simultaneously in a way that reinforced each other's actions in a virtuous circle, right? And so it sort of just happened automatically. And so that was sort of interesting to us as maybe an example of how the international order was a bit more resilient, right? Without these formal meetings. Now, you didn't have, in the Trump administration, you didn't have officials actively blocking. Mnuchin was actually pretty helpful. President, I think, was not really focused on it, but he certainly wasn't objecting or trying to stymie the central bank response. So that was one area. And the other, which is more of a mixed bag, is on vaccine development. And really, the failure of COVAX, partly because, or mainly because maybe of the lack of great power participation. The US wasn't a part of it, China wasn't a part of it till later on, but the COVAX had very little role in vaccine development. We really did see vaccine nationalism take place, but actually that sort of succeeded in the development part, right? And so in the development part with warp speed, and even with the Chinese and Russian vaccines, and even with the European contribution to some of those vaccines, they did give us a number of pretty effective vaccines in a very rapid period of time. And it's our view that part of that was because of this sort of marketplace, particularly in the United States, where you had this real cooperation between the private sector and the government that you probably wouldn't have had if it was a formally multilateral approach because of the divergence in views. So that was sort of another interesting example. Obviously, the distribution part of the vaccine has gone much worse at a global level. And that's one area where COVAX would be very important and very significant. So just to finish up in terms of where we are and where we're headed, we're only in a post-pandemic world, I think, in the sense that we're in a period after COVID is hit, right? Not that COVID is over. And we try to make that point sort of in the book. But I think we have a major global challenge still in front of us. And what worries me is that government officials are looking at it around the world more as a matter of development assistance and foreign assistance rather than as the latest front in an existential struggle against the pandemic. Right? And we need to have a mindset, I think, that we only have a very limited period of time to be able to make real progress on vaccinating the world, which is our best defense against COVID. But overall, the main lesson, I think, for us is that we are sort of faced as a country, as an international community, with two near worst case scenarios, both on great power competition and transnational threats, right? If you look over the last 10 years, transnational threats were even worse than they were or expected to be 10 years ago, climate change and pandemics. And great power rivalry isn't a hot war, but it's pretty close to a cold one. And those two dynamics have this negative synergy between them. And the main lesson, I think, is that we can't be waiting for one of those to fundamentally change. We have to deal with both of those simultaneously. And we have to deal with both of them being sort of severe and protracted. And so we should be trying to work with China for sure. We should be working within the WHO, trying to engage China on global public health. But we also need a backup plan if that cooperation doesn't work, right? So we need a way of preparing without expecting full cooperation from China. I would say we have a number of recommendations in the book. Many of them have been bouncing around for a while because, of course, these challenges have been around for a while. But one of the ideas that we have that is a bit new, maybe, is that the United States should build a global alliance for pandemic preparedness of like-minded countries that would adhere to higher standards of transparency and the provision of global public goods, to basically prepare for future pandemics to set a higher standard. And then other countries could come on board with that. But in a future crisis, we may have those countries be willing to act on their own in response to a future crisis in a coordinated way, including by putting pressure on countries that aren't coming up to that standard. And we believe that that will be not only compatible with the IHRs and the WHO, but would sort of strengthen global governance around global public health. And that's part of what we mean by a backup plan. The final thing I would just say is that, this is not just about pandemics. I think one of the things that's most concerning is sort of on climate change, where the costs are longer, less evenly distributed. It's more of a slow burn crisis. And if we find it this hard to cooperate in response to a very immediate, severe crisis, I think it really does raise question marks about how we'll be able to deal with climate change in the future. So we are sort of concerned there. But at the same time, we believe that this is a more, maybe finishing on a partially optimistic note, this is really a warning. COVID is a warning. We could have a worse crisis in the future, whether it's a worse pandemic with a higher fatality rate or something to do with climate change or something else. So what this pandemic really tells us is it reveals what we are really like as an international order in responding to these threats, and it illuminates those areas where we need to improve. So we have a pretty good idea now, I think, of what improvements are needed, and the question is, will we learn those lessons in the future? So Harold, I think I'm at the half-hour mark there, so I'll wrap up, and I really look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much for your talk, Tom. As Tom said, we have time, about half an hour for Q&A. We will be taking questions from the room as well as questions online. If you're joining us online, please go ahead and enter any questions you might have in the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll incorporate those into the conversation. Now, as is our usual practice at CSAC, we often ask our pre and postdoctoral fellows to ask the first few questions. So please go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to get on the queue, but just know that I'll give initial priority to our fellows before opening it up to the whole group. Ryan Musto, and please remember to identify yourself when you ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. My name is Ryan Musto. I'm a nuclear security postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. I was wondering if you could talk about vaccine diplomacy, especially in the developing world. How would you score US efforts in terms of vaccine distribution worldwide? And what does that maybe say about US influence in developing regions?
Should I take them one by one?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I think everyone has fallen short, and I think the US is no exception to that. I think there's a couple of things going on. One is, if you were to ask, Mike Ryan at the WHO, how best do you use a limited supply of vaccines? What he said and would say, and what public health experts, as far as I know, would say is that you don't want to just vaccinate entire countries individually. You want to vaccinate certain categories of people. So you should certainly vaccinate your vulnerable people initially. But before you vaccinate, 20-something, 30-something, you should vaccinate global frontline healthcare workers around the world, right? So that would be that's a rational sort of way to do it. But the political reality is that that's basically impossible, right? Because governments are responsible to their citizens. They have an obligation to do that. People would demand that. And in our sort of conversations with WHO officials, they basically acknowledged that. They said, look, we know we're sort of saying this thing publicly, but we're fully aware that, that there's a political reality that all leaders, including Biden, need to deal with. And we just hope they get to the international peace quickly, right? So I think we can sort of set that aside a little bit, that we, ideally, if you had just a fully sort of science-based response, it might be a bit different, but that's not the world we're in, and probably not the world we should be in. It's important that governments are responsive to their own people, and they do focus on those domestic vaccinations. That said, I would say that there was still sort of a general delay in the United States and elsewhere in terms of really pivoting to that global peace. And for the Biden administration, that crunch point really came with India, right? They sort of thought they had till June, till the G7 summit, they were going to roll out sort of global vaccine works. But then Delta happened in India in a really dramatic way. And to their credit, I think they responded pretty quickly. They were a little bit slow in terms of like the first few days, but then they did realize that, and they did act, and they did send sort of vaccines out. And since then, they've done a lot. They've done maybe more than any other country in the world. The G7 committed, I think, 1 billion vaccines, or 870 million vaccines in June, and subsequently increased. Over 500 million of those were from the US, right? So I think they've done quite a bit. But the reason I worry that they're falling short is that the WHO estimate for global vaccine, to get to 70% globally is 11 billion doses. Right, so 1 billion doses is still less than 10% of the total that we need. And that's before booster shots are taken into account. So we have an enormous task ahead. So I just think that all governments need to be massively upping their game, and it's partially money and vaccine supply, but it's also distribution. And I think the real question will be this weekend, is this something the G20 is going to be focused on? Are we going to see a real coming together from China and the US and others to do this? My expectation is we won't. China's not particularly interested in playing sort of along with this. They're doing their own thing. The Russians are doing their thing. I mean, I don't know if anyone's following this on Twitter, but Sputnik, the Russian vaccine, has its own Twitter account, and it spends its time putting out disinformation about Pfizer. So you have one vaccine Twitter account trolling another to say, their rivals are useless. So that obviously comes from some official source. So I think we're still seeing that rivalry really undermine sort of a collective approach. But I do think, the US, since Biden came in, they have been doing quite a lot, but I think a lot more needs to be done.
Thanks. I have Sana, Luis, and Thor, and then Sigrid. So Sana?
Okay. Hi, I'm Sanna Verschuren. I'm one of the postdoctoral fellows in the nuclear domain. And I have two questions. The first one is you talked a lot about like what COVID meant for internal politics in Europe, but I also wonder what it means, according to you, for the external parts of Europe. So what does COVID tell us about the role of Europe in the world going forward? And then the second question is, to what extent can we expect the lessons that you draw here to kind of work among policymakers to apply them to climate change, which is a whole different challenge, a much larger challenge, and a much more complicated challenge too. So to what extent can we expect policymakers to draw inferences from what just happened and apply them to this other domain? Thank you.
Thanks. Great questions. On Europe, I think one thing we learned was that Europe was not able to fill the vacuum on global leadership. And I say that as a fan of the EU. And I think, as I said, they had a very difficult situation. I think they made a lot of mistakes, but I think they came out stronger and overall. But they weren't able to convene the world with Trump with the US out of the picture. They weren't able to pick up that mantle. And even when they sort of realized they sort of needed to, they did increase funding for the WHO and for COVAX. They did try to keep the lights on, in that regard. But in terms of being able to have really sort of concerted international leadership, it was just a reach too far for them. I think they were dealing with that crisis sort of within the EU. And I think they'll learn lessons. I mean, they want to improve. I think they're going to have a real lessons learned thing there. They did correct course a lot on the vaccine, in early 2021 and change their approach in a way that I think was really beneficial for them. But it's still, it's still more at the foreign policy level. I think there's still a bit of a disconnect. And I also think on the foreign policy level, the senior foreign policy leaders in the EU really had no real awareness that global public health is a security issue. So they just weren't as focused on that early on, and to some extent still struggle with that a little bit, I think. So in terms of, sorry, just one prompt on the second question was, oh yeah. I don't know what their lessons they are going to take. I think the lesson they should take is that, there are real geopolitical aspects to transnational threats, right? And we have to respond to them in a way that recognizes those geopolitical realities. And so on climate, climate is as likely to be a source of tension as cooperation with China. And the question is, how do we use that so that competition is somewhat positive? So both China and the US make progress on climate rather than holding out for some grand bargain that's never going to come. So I think it should make us more realistic, about the, about what we need to do. But I don't know if that will be the lesson. I mean, you're seeing it play out now a little bit with, even someone like John Kerry has a certain view, and that's different than maybe some others. And so it's a legitimate debate. Like, do you have those bilateral deals, or do you try to, work with each other if possible, but really sort of do your own thing, because that's where you can make more rapid progress. So I think we'll see that debate play out in the coming years.
Thanks. Luis?
Thank you. My name is Luis Rodriguez. I'm an Stanton Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow here. Thanks for the talk. I can't wait to read the book. I'm wondering, was it all international order that ended with the pandemic, or that you see ending with the pandemic? Because geopolitical rivalries, dysfunctional multilateral responses, problems of coordination and collaboration already existed in the pre-pandemic international order. So I wonder if by this you mean the end of multilateral/international collaboration, or the end of the U.S. leadership in this international order. Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of the subtitle, yeah, what we mean very specifically is that the prospects of the major powers working together on shared challenges and threats, is no longer very likely. It may never have been likely, but I think it was actually, because it happened in 0809 with the financial crisis response, where you had the world leaders come together and respond in a unified way, and that world is largely over. Maybe it will come back, but it's hard to see. So that's what we mean by it. And I guess as a secondary thing, that U.S. And U.S. allied sort of dominance in these institutions is over, and COVID sort of highlighted that. I think the WHO particularly highlighted. So what's the strategy to sort of cope with that going forward? So those are probably the two aspects to it.
Hi, I'm Gaurav Pawar, and I'm visiting scholar here at CSAC. So my question here is, so you mentioned like two broad issues. So one is like COVID, and another is like climate change. So how we see transition from COVID to climate change? So because they are two very broad issues, right? So we need to have some anchoring point. We need to have some bridging point. So how do you think?
How do we move from one to the? Well, I mean, we're trying to do both. I mean, obviously, climate is an ongoing crisis and challenge. I think the point we try to make is that climate is going to be harder because it's more of a slow burn. I mean, COVID is something. If you were to design a crisis that should have generated international cooperation, it would have been a pandemic that affects every person on the planet at the same time in sort of the same way, in a way that's obviously bad. I mean, one would assume that's the closest to an alien invasion we're ever going to get, probably in terms of a collective, just everyone's losers. There needs to be a common response. So it didn't happen. So that should make us very worried that something like climate, where there are definitely people who are very significant, will lose very significantly, but there are others who feel they may not be affected, because they live in a different place, or because they won't be around, when the climate change crisis really hits. And there's all sorts of different uneven distributions to do with climate costs, and then the price of actually dealing with it. There's a real price as well, so people don't want to pay that. They don't want to transition to a different type of energy model. So it's much more complicated. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be much harder. And we're seeing that sort of play out. I think we'll see that at the weekend or next couple of weeks of COP26. So I think we need to move to it because because it is a major challenge. But I think what this crisis really shows us is that we shouldn't expect easy breakthroughs. The geopolitics of this are very real.
Great. I have Sigrid, then we go online to our affiliate Dave Elliott, and then we'll go over to Paul Edwards. So Sigrid.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm Sigrid Lupieri. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. And my question is about the role of international or supranational institutions like the WHO going forward. Do you think going forward you see a greater role even without US leadership of these supranational institutions? Or do you think we're going to see more the creation of parallel institutions and alliances, like maybe, as you were mentioning earlier, a global alliance led by the US?
I think they're worried about, I think there's a pretty big worry, which I would share, about the WHO becoming a zone of competition between countries. For David Fiddler at Georgetown has done some great work on this, that, in the Cold War, the Soviets and the US cooperated in smallpox eradication, a few other things. But what's sort of interesting is, for the most part, the Cold War rivalry didn't really, global health wasn't a piece of that, right? It wasn't, there weren't that many clashes between them. And he gets into sort of the detail to show that it wasn't quite an easy lift, but it wasn't a super difficult one either. And on this occasion, it's much more contested. And if you look at, what we're asking of China, we're asking for much greater transparency and cooperation. That gets to sort of core sovereignty questions, and it gets to real, you're really sort of in each other's stuff at that point. So there are real reasons they might not do it. But there's also real reasons we need them to do it. And they may have similar asks, of us. And so I think you could see, in the same way the UN in the 1940s was meant to bring the world together, but very quickly became a venue for rivalry. There's a worry that the WHO will become a venue for rivalry. So everyone says, reform the IHRs, reform the WHO, give it more strength. But that negotiation is going to be brutal. And you may see different camps emerge and maybe a gridlock. So I think it's going to be, I think it's going to be tough. And then I think the question is, yes, each side will sort of organize. The US and other like-minded countries will try to build a caucus for reform and push that. But, what happens when that, just doesn't help move the gridlock? China just has not too much, it has a lot of influence in the WHO because it's a large country and, has a bunch of other countries that agree with it. So, so I think it's going to be pretty contested. And so I do think you'll see some of these, parallel, institutions. But our sort of focus in the book is to try to do that in a way that reinforces the case for reform at the WHO, right? So I think it's really important if the US does its own thing or works with other like-minded allies, that it does so in a way that does not undermine the universal efforts. I think that's sort of the key point, and that's the key point of difference with maybe how the previous administration was approaching it.
Thank you. Now let's go to a question from our CSAC network affiliate, Dave Elliott. He asked you to speak about the role of Russia during the pandemic. I mean, the talk has been fairly focused on the US and China. Yeah. Russia obviously announced a vaccine earlier than others, but they're facing a record number of illnesses and deaths. Just integrate them into the discussion.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, they're maybe having their worst moment of the pandemic right now. Like Moscow's in a lockdown. I did an event the other day with Carnegie Moscow, and sort of interesting to hear from them just how bad things are. The death fatality rate is extremely high. Putin's not coming to the G20 summit at the weekend because of the COVID crisis. The vaccine pickup in Russia is very low. It's about 30%. Which is sort of surprising because, in the Soviet days, vaccines were mandatory. There was really no sort of dissent allowed on a lot of this stuff. And Russia has as evidenced by Sputnik, which is not as effective as, nearly as effective as Moderna or Pfizer, but is also still seems to be, a better vaccine, for instance, than Sinovac in terms of its effectiveness. They have some capability there and knowledge. So I think they're in a very difficult, position right now. And, unless they can get the vaccination rate up, it's going to be pretty difficult for them in a winter of Delta with something that transmissible. But I think that may be one reason why, they are focusing more on the vaccine piece of it now. For the most part, they weren't a major geopolitical player in the pandemic. I mean, every country, obviously, the pandemic matters a lot, and they dealt with this. I don't think Russia dealt with it particularly well, but in terms of its influence globally, I guess its impact was less because it was more sort of a national-based actor, whereas China's actions had sort of an outsized impact. And it was the US because it was used to being the provider of leadership in global crises, where that absence of leadership was particularly profound. So that's sort of why we focus more on that piece of it.
So we're turned now to Paul.
Thanks. I'm Paul Edwards. I'm a senior research scholar at CSAC and also the director or co-director of the Stanford Existential Risks Initiative. So I'm very interested in what you have to say, and I thought it was a great talk. One of my own major foci is climate change, so I want to kind of follow up on that. Somewhere in the talk, you had an idea for what you thought should happen under the circumstances. Involving kind of multilateral but limited groups cooperating on standards for vaccines and improving the health organization for the next pandemic. And I'm wondering what you think of that strategy with respect to climate change, because so far the only strategies we've had are entire planet top down and entire planet bottom up. And it strikes me, one of the things Obama seemed to have been focused on around the time of the Copenhagen climate conference, equivalent of Glasgow, was to bring together, the EU, the US, Brazil, China, India, and a couple of other major players who account for most of the emissions, and try to make a deal just with them without having to go through every other country in the world. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that kind of strategy and whether that's similar to what you meant by strategy for COVID.
It's a great question, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it too, because I'm sure you already have thought a lot more about it than I have. But I guess the main message of the main sort of argument of the book, I guess if you distill it down, is that we need to take political constraints seriously, both domestically and internationally, but particularly internationally. So, we have to be realistic about the world that we're in, and the likelihood of other countries, and including our own country, actually doing the right thing. And I think on climate, I don't want to give up for sure, but it just seems pretty clear that the approach so far, that we're basically arguing with gravity in some ways in terms of, just those impulses and the differences, and those are becoming more severe. So, Biden is saying to the Chinese, we want to work together on climate, and they're saying, well, no, you have to create the conditions for cooperation, which include conceding on Taiwan and Hong Kong and Xinjiang. And, we're not even going to discuss it until that really takes place. And that's what's leading to this sort of disagreement over how to respond to that. So all of that sort of a roundabout way to getting to the answer to your question, which is, I suspect, there were sort of, to already simplify, I think there are sort of two ways to go about this. One is to try to get cooperation from other countries, particularly the major countries. And I think the major countries are the problem, right? I mean, it's more efficient to focus on them, but they're also the source of the obstruction, and not just others, like including the United States, obviously. So that might be option A. Option B is to think really about how do we harness these competitive tensions for a positive purpose. So for instance, we can't get Republican buy-in really in anything to do with climate in terms of emissions control. But if it was framed legitimately as, a contest for first mover advantage on clean technology, like on clean tech, and that access to resources and developing this new technology and investment, that's something that the US needed to be worried about what China and others would do in it. And so we had to catch up and be in the lead on that. That might be more sellable politically. And it might actually not really require cooperation with China. And if the US and China were actually engaged in a major race to develop clean technology because they were worried about each other, would that be such a bad thing? I mean, that might actually leave us off in a better position. And I feel the same way about vaccines, actually. You know, if China wants to send vaccines around the world to increase their influence and outdo the US, you know, that probably nets out positive, right? If we're each trying to outdo the other in terms of distributing the vaccine, yes, theirs may not be as effective, but, you know, we have a massive supply shortage internationally. And at some point, someone who got one that's ineffective can get another one that's more effective later when that's available, you know, because you're allowed to mix and match in this. So I guess what I'm sort of wondering on climate is, to what extent is can competition and geopolitical competition be harnessed for sort of a positive end as a race to the top, as opposed to, you know, a race to sort of gridlock. But I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are others here who probably know in more detail about that. But that argument is getting out there now, and I think it's a very it's going to be a very difficult one to absorb, you know, because I think we've all been so committed to the idea of sort of symmetry and a compromise. But at a certain point, you know, I mean, look at the United States. Like, how is it credible, you know, if power is split at least 50-50 between Republicans and Democrats, how is U.S. commitments over the long term on climate in terms of emission reductions? I mean, how is that a credible commitment? I don't have an answer to that question, but maybe the clean tech piece will be more durable.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question from Gil Baram, a short question.
Hi, I'm Gil Baram. I'm a cybersecurity postdoctoral fellow. And I wonder what you think about the effect of emerging technologies on this international order. And as you mentioned, the attempts to do personal diplomacy with China. And in the meanwhile, Chinese hackers were attacking the vaccine manufacturers and the World Health Organizations. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you very
On
much.
emerging technologies in general, or specifically related to the pandemic?
I only have enough time.
Okay.
Pandemic.
Specifically related.
Yeah. Well, look, just two brief points. One, disinformation is completely out of control in the pandemic, you know, and you had, unfortunately, countries, you know, particularly, I think, Russia and China, I'll get onto the US in a second, but, you know, acting as if their interests are served by undermining public confidence, you know, in important public health measures. You know, so about lockdowns or vaccines or therapeutics or other things. And it's obviously absolutely outrageous and, you know, very detrimental. And it's hard to imagine how that could serve anyone's interests. Not to let the US off the hook, you know, the president of the United States, according to multiple studies, was the world's single largest disseminator of disinformation about the pandemic, right, on basically a nightly basis. And so that's sort of a huge problem too. So there's lots of blame to go around here, but I think, you know, really should give us pause for thought in terms of when people say the world needs to work together on this. You know, some of the stuff that's coming out of Beijing in particular, I think, on the US response or European response to COVID is deeply concerning. And I think that's, you know, that's something I think we need to really think about in terms of future pandemic preparedness.
Well, I'm afraid we're at time. Please join me in thanking Dr. Tom Wright for joining us to talk about his new book, Aftershocks.
Thank you so much.